feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Cool boy. You're such a cool boy.
I wonder if that's timed correctly at all, based
Probably
on
not,
feedback or anything. No. Today we are reviewing Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, which will be released on December 10th with previews on the 9th. Starring Ansel Elgort, Ariana DeBose, David Alvarez, Mike Faist, Rita Moreno, Rachel Zegler, and more. Not necessarily a remake, but another version of West Side Story, a more kind of faithful to the material version of it, and Spielberg's first full-on musical, which is kind of interesting. Eric, how are you?
I'm okay, Matt. I am excited to talk about this because in a lot of ways, this was kind of one of the big awards movies that we needed to see before our voting deadline, and also kind of considering where this might fall, come Oscars. The original film, which was released back in 1961, which is 60 years old now, and also starred Rita Moreno in as the Ariana role, which basically is sort of like one of the pivotal characters. Is kind of considered by a lot of people to be a classic, and it's not necessarily a bad movie. I think one of the things I really like about that period of musical is just kind of like the hyper stylized look of things, especially with kind of like the vibrant colors, but it's also really problematic because you have a lot of actors in brown face, and also Natalie Wood, who is or was a good actor, was dubbed, and she couldn't really sing even though she wanted to. And so, there were problems with it, even though it is considered a classic by many. I mean, it is an Oscar-winning film, so it has that going for it. And then when you get someone like Spielberg, who, to your point, has never directed a full-on musical before, but there have been elements in movies like Temple of Doom, the second Indiana Jones movie, which is actually a prequel to Indiana Jones with his Busby Berkeley kind of opening dance number. But then you look at even films like, E.T. And E.T. kind of, has moments that are very kinetic and rhythmic and choreographed in a way that, John Williams' score takes over, and the cast in certain scenes, like especially with the flying bikes, could be considered almost kind of musical-esque in sort of an operatic kind of way. Spielberg is a guy that we have talked a lot about more recently, kind of being statesman-like in his filmography and kind of doing sort of historical biopics or dramas that maybe more are of interest to him based on where he is in his life and his age. And he has earned the right to make those movies, but for some may be expecting another E.T. or Close Encounters or Jaws or
Jurassic
Raiders or Jurassic Park, maybe aren't as interested in Lincoln or Bridge of Spies, which again, that's totally fine. I think they're really solid films, but they're not maybe, the playful and engaged Spielberg that probably a lot of people grew up loving. This movie kind of feels like that Spielberg, the original Spielberg that you grew up watching movies like Jurassic Park or Jaws, kind of came back with this. He feels completely invigorated and playful with the material. And I think the most sort of praise I can give this film is that it's pure spectacle.
Yep.
This movie is pure spectacle, even clocking in at nearly 3 hours long. It moves at a pace that feels perfectly in time with the storytelling, with the cinematography. The production design is fantastic. Even if you don't give into the conceit of, dancing and singing gang members, which is obviously something that I think is difficult for some people, myself included.
I'm
It's
with
hard.
you. Yeah.
It's hard not to at least respect and love the production of the film. But the more I get away from it, I do really like the movie as a whole, and I think he corrects a lot of the things that were wrong with the original movie.
Yeah, a lot of the movie is in Spanish with no subtitles, which I think is really interesting. I agree with you that, you know, the cast is more authentic, and yeah, and I'm right there with you. The more I was a little soft on the movie when we first got out, and I tweeted this out the other day, which I think is an interesting conversation that maybe we'll go into in another main podcast or something like that, where um, I'm kind of glad sometimes where I sit on a movie for a bit before we either record our review, or we always have a wonderful conversation that I wish, you know, is a separate show, like a mini podcast right when we get out of a movie. Me and you usually run away from everyone else and we have our own little mini
We
live
dance away,
podcast
actually.
and talk about a movie. And this was one where I think we were both like a little soft on. I'm going like, you know, it's obviously like objectively a well-made movie. But you know, this being, you know, a movie that was made 60 years ago and just another version of West Side Story. You know, I was kind of my first exposure to West Side Story, because I've never actually even seen the original. So I can't even argue that. But so it's hard to pick apart the story elements, which I think do get a little silly and little eye rolly by the end. So you focus on the spectacle, and I think the spectacle is there, and the technical prowess of a master filmmaker is throughout this entire movie. And I just found myself thinking about it more, listening to the soundtrack a bit on Apple Music, which is available in Dolby Atmos and stuff too. And you know, all the songs, even if I hadn't seen West Side Story, I either knew a lot of it, I knew some of the more iconic songs and scenes, Officer Krupke, I Feel Pretty, America, if that's what the song's called, but I think it's called America, right?
And yeah, and Cool Boys and
Cool
things
Boys.
like
Yeah,
that.
like I know a lot of it. I've just never sat down and watched it as a whole. But reflecting on the movie and thinking about it, I think it has some fantastic performances. I think Rachel Zegler is fantastic. Ariana DeBose is fantastic. David Alvarez is fantastic. Mike Faist is fantastic. Rita Moreno, you know, bringing her back in a different role, I think is wonderful. And I think there's some really, really good both musical and just captivating performances throughout the movie. And I think it has a really good energy to it. I think pacing a little weird of the arrangement of some of the songs. Like I feel like I Feel Pretty is in a very weird spot in the movie, and kind of deflates a scene that happens prior. And I think, you know, again, I found myself during every musical sequence, the way that Spielberg moved the camera and how elaborate the sets were and the performances were, I found myself mesmerized often by, like, you know, what felt like hundreds of people moving around and in front of the camera, but you're still fixed onto the person who's performing. But then you're also looking at this crazy elaborate choreography and these gigantic sets that clearly look like movie sets, but it just kind of fits the movie. Yeah, so I just found myself thinking about it and going, you know what, as much as I didn't care about the story as a whole, or I still found it kind of silly of, you know, being these two gangs and they would break out into song, or I feel like some of the emotional stuff doesn't work super well for me because it's undercut by some of that kind of performance of it. And that's just kind of a musical problem for me, where I think like you really got to work hard to have a serious musical and for it to work on both, you know, an exciting performance level from the music side and then also on that emotional level. And I feel like the movie doesn't necessarily nail those emotional beats, but then that's kind of maybe just the issue with the musical itself or the story itself. Like some character choices are very, very weird to me, and you kind of just have to roll with it. And then you go, well, am I here for that, or am I here for the spectacle? And I think ultimately you are here for the spectacle. And he really does deliver on that. Like there are some sequences that have stuck in my mind, that are just like kind of classic Spielberg shots, and he brings a lot of himself into this, and you go, wow, I can't believe he's never made a musical because he is very, very good at it. And I'd be open to seeing, another Spielberg musical down the line, maybe even something original or something that hasn't been adapted before. But I just found myself, while I was a little soft, it's grown on me, and I've gone, you know what, I would watch this again, or I would show it to family, or I would sit through it again, and it just has like an energy to it that is really, really kind of captivating. And I will say, I don't think Ansel Elgort is very good. I think he's, again, I think you don't have to take out the real world stuff, because I think it is kind of wild that he's doing press for the movie, and that they haven't really addressed, the whole thing that happened with him late last year or into this year. I forget when it even was, but that removed, there's something off with him. I think everyone else in the cast is really good, and then his singing voice and stuff is fine. But there are a few moments, like me and you even laughed at one moment, where his facial expression is just so over the top and so kind of ridiculous that I burst out laughing. And then that's the kind of shit that undercuts some of those emotional beats. So I don't think he works super well. But yeah, man, I've thought about the movie a lot, and I'm like, you know what, I would watch this again, and I would watch it and tell my family to watch it. And had from a technical standpoint, it's immaculate.
Yeah, it really does. Like, it's always hard to create a movie musical, especially when you're introducing the rules of that movie musical. And I think in the first scene of this film, Spielberg does a pretty good job of kind of establishing the tone and sort of the rhythm of what the movie is going to kind of move at. And even to the point where after the first scene is over, there's a really clever match cut, which Spielberg is so good at doing. But watching this movie and then thinking about it, yeah, absolutely. And watching and thinking about this movie, the more in terms of like the cinematography point of view, at first I was a little bit sort of underwhelmed by it, in the sense that I felt like maybe it clashed a bit with sort of the classic nature, or the timeless nature, or the period sort of aesthetic of what it is, with kind of, Janusz Kaminski's kind of more modern kind of look, especially with the abrasive sort of lens flares specifically. But I almost think that works for this adaptation, the more I think about it, because you look at the world that Spielberg is presenting, this kind of small part of New York that is basically going through gentrification. And it's almost like not just a musical, but a Western, and also a dystopian thriller in a weird way, because it's almost like the people that remain in this kind of wasteland are kind of coming to the surface and battling for what's left. And the way that, he uses the camera and kind of with this crane shot at the beginning, rising out of Lincoln Square, like that sequence in particular, it almost kind of looks like a dystopian sort of, sci-fi horror movie. And you watch, these two group of people, which again, contextually kind of brings new meaning to what's going on in the US right now, with divisions in the world, where you have, the Jets and the Sharks, the Jets being Caucasians and the Sharks being Puerto Rican, and sort of what that means as well, with sort of the racial divide and that tension, and how kind of silly it also is. And someone like Bernardo, who realizes how silly it is, and he even admits to that, but also still goes through with it, because it's about representation and pride. And to your point you already made, Tony Kushner's script is confident enough in the audience's ability, but also in the storytelling, to omit subtitles and allow the Afro-Latin and Latin characters to speak their own language without the need of interpretation, because you can understand what's going on.
Yeah.
You can see it for yourself. Yeah, you might lose some nuance if you don't speak Spanish, but I think Spielberg,
and you probably gain a lot
Kushner,
from speaking Spanish. But I just sorry to cut in, Eric, but
yeah,
I think the movie just did such a good job at, whether it felt very natural the way that they spoke, right? Because half of it was in English and half was in Spanish, and they would almost flow and intertwine with one another, or they would repeat something that they just said and said it in English. And they even put that, and use it in the context of the story of like, they're like, well, we're here now. You need to speak English. And you'll hear a character say that. So I thought that was like a kind of really clever way. And it doesn't hinge on you being like, well, we need to spoon feed you everything, or you need to know every word that they're saying. It's just from their actions or them repeating the dialogue in English after, you'll get it. Or even like a movie, you can just watch the visuals and you'll kind of understand what's happening and what they're saying just based on what's actually happening. So
yeah, and I mean, obviously, with Stephen Sondheim passing away as well, there's maybe an emotional connection to this film that otherwise wouldn't be there if you're looking at it from like just the point of view of like, how this movie got made and how it's kind of a tribute to him as a playwright and as a storyteller and as a lyricist. And the Leonard Bernstein score is fantastic, and it has been so influential and iconic throughout the decades to other productions, and in the same way that like this is just basically Romeo and Juliet, but kind of a new version of it. But I love when somebody takes something old and sort of reinvents it and changes it around. And I think that this is the best version of what West Side Story is for the 21st century. I think any other version that was going to be made, whether Spielberg did it or not, might not have succeeded. I think Spielberg's version is the best version of a movie that still has some problems, as you mentioned, with its leading man, both on screen and off screen. But I think a lot of the representation and also just in the casting, not in the representation, but in sort of the real finds. Rachel Zegler, I think, is right up there with Spielberg discovering or being one of the first people to use Drew Barrymore.
Yeah, she's going to be a massive star. Yeah.
Or Christian Bale in Empire of the Sun. Like Spielberg's one of those guys that I think, he gets a lot of credit, and obviously rightfully so, but he's always a guy that casts really interestingly. A lot of these cast members are up and comers or relatively just new to movies. Like even Mike Faist, who plays Riff, is really, really good in this movie. And
he was just a stage actor, wasn't he? Or
yeah, and he's kind of a tragic character in his own right, where like Riff is a bully and a racist and an asshole, but the movie explores him enough to kind of find empathy of saying like, okay, well, he comes from a broken home and a background where there's no support, where at least Bernardo, has that, and Maria does too. They have each other, where, Tony is a very sort of mixed bag to begin with, because obviously he's a character who has his own sort of haunted past, and he's also kind of grappling with trying to change. And so, like there's that kind of relationship that I think is kind of interesting as well. Elgort, his singing voice is fine. I think there's nobody in this movie that's like a Pierce Brosnan in a Mamma Mia kind of way.
He's
but
not distractingly bad, but
but in terms of performance, he's not up to par with the rest of the cast. Yeah. And then if you are taking into consideration sort of the allegations outside of the movie, it does have a creepiness in terms of like almost him sort of like grooming this younger girl and sort of bringing her into his world, and vice versa. It just kind of does play a little bit, maybe.
I just found the character even not to be super likable. Like, I mean, it's just, you're not really cheering for him. And then that's the biggest, I think, issue I had with the final act when it comes to it's hard to criticize a story. Like it's West Side Story. It's iconic, but like,
but Tony is a weak character, especially amongst all this amazing cast that are kind of bringing a freshness. And again, I think casting newcomers or relative newcomers, you don't sort of project something that you already expect, and maybe that also doesn't help Ansel Elgort, because he's
the one known actor kind of.
Yeah, I mean, Rita Moreno is obviously a legend as well, and she's playing Doc this time around, and the way that they kind of changed that character and sort of what she's doing there, I think is interesting. And some of the character actors like Corey Stoll kind of popping up, like obviously people will recognize him
a little bit more caricatures. I mean, a lot of the people are kind of, again, that happens in musicals and stage adaptations because it's written in a way that's a little bit more, performative. But yeah, Brian Darcy James as Krupke is a little like a little kind of
But it's
ridiculous at times,
fine
but it's
because
fun.
it's such a small
Yeah.
role, and like ultimately you kind of know where the story's
And you
going,
get to
especially
pay off
because
with the song too.
yeah, with Romeo and Juliet and things like that. But I think it delivers at least on, as you mentioned, technically, but also like it's just so well made that you're just kind of like, okay, like maybe emotionally I can't get on board with it, but at least I can really respect and appreciate it. And it is just interesting that, this year also Within the Heights, which also kind of focus on Washington Heights and sort of the Puerto
Gentrification,
Rican
yeah.
sort of sector there as well. Like it's just interesting that you're looking at two sides of a story of like past and present, but also again, West Side Story, the Spielberg version kind of does feel almost like it's dystopian at times. It kind of has a Western kind of vibe as well. Like it's almost like,
And that's the production design too adds to that. And that's
oh,
like it's
absolutely.
like it I was again, as much as I was mesmerized by the choreography and the musical performances, just the way that he shot a lot of these, like they spent an insane amount of money on these sets. Like I know it says $100 million for the budget, which is still pretty high for a movie and a musical. But these sets that they build, and it's another conversation we had of like, why didn't they recast Ansel Elgort? And obviously they're backing him because he's doing all the press and shit like that. So I mean, if they did their own investigation or whatever, but it's an expensive looking movie because like the sets, I think that add to that dystopian kind of feel because it's like these broken buildings and these construction sites and things like that, and they're just these massive sets. And then when you come at the period setting and like I know someone commented on what they said was product placement, but for me, it's just set dressing. Like I nerd out over stuff like that too. Like I love seeing old packages and old candy packages and soda packages. So like having a part of this take place in that convenience store or the bodega is just wonderful to me because like as much as I'm in the scenes that aren't necessarily the musical moments and they're just happening in the store, I'm still kind of looking around the frame and just admiring like the set dressing and like how elaborate these sets were, especially when you're outside. And they do look like movie sets. Like I won't say that I was ever like, oh my god, it looks like I'm transported back to New York in the it's the 50s, right?
Yeah.
I never once was like, this feels realistic, but I don't think it needed to have that. It just needed to have this spectacle to it. And I think the sets and the production design do like add to that.
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to the timing of scenes, like I think some of the tracking shots and the single takes are really really impressive, and
Yeah.
obviously Spielberg can pull that out of his hat and can do this in his sleep. But like you look at again at that opening sequence, there's this one shot of like everything's kind of happening on the street, like in the background, like people are kind of going about their day and walking in and out of stores and things like that, and the way that that's all timed must
Yeah.
have been like
Like
I
walking
can't
in front of the
imagine all the
frame and stuff
production.
too. Like, and even the dance numbers too. There's so many times where people are going through and you're following a character as everyone's dancing around them. And it's like, it's really, really impressive. So like ultimately my score is not going to show that because like, I never felt super invested in the material. It almost felt like a series of not music videos, but performances or something like that, where I never really cared about what was happening. And I think that's my biggest problem with the movie. And even Spielberg putting that so much into it and being so good at a lot of that just never got my hooks of caring about anyone of either side of Maria. I didn't like Tony, the character. Like I didn't like some of the decisions Maria makes in the last act where it just felt like it completely took me out of the movie, even though I know they're not really going to change that. And it is Romeo and Juliet and it is an iconic story, but like, there's just some stuff there that I was just like, narratively doesn't necessarily work for me from a technical standpoint and a performances and the music. I think it does. So I'm going to give the movie a 3.5. I still think it's quite good. And I ultimately, the more I think about it, the more I enjoyed it. but it did suffer from me really getting invested in it, and I think that was its biggest issue for me.
Yeah, I would say the emotion there is lacking, even though the performances
are good,
are compelling, and I really did like Rachel Zegler a lot.
Same.
She is an emotional core, and I really liked David Alvarez, and I think
everything up until the last moments of those decisions in the last moments, and I can't blame the performances because they're all really good and they give it their all. But
yeah, absolutely. And then, like, again, the other thing I do think that is kind of tragic about the story ultimately isn't just sort of this star-crossed lover kind of scenario that, again, is Romeo and Juliet, but I almost feel like the true tragedy, especially in this day and age, is like, you know, these two groups of people are fighting really for no reason whatsoever by the color of their skin, and that's it.
They're both being pushed out of this area, really.
Exactly. And it's like you guys, if you put aside your differences and work together to fight against something that is truly, you know, sinister, which is, you know, corporate sort of industry, that's the thing you need to fight against, like, not each other. And like that's the true tragedy of this. Like, I think that, especially now when you think of like other movies that have kind of like tackled gentrification in a really interesting way, like The Last Black Man in San Francisco, and movies like that, where it's like, okay, we're looking at it from a more modern point of view, but at the same time it's like, you know, things really don't change. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, we're willing to pick a fight with each other instead of, you know, working together and cooperating and fighting the thing that is actually destroying us and actually basically destroying the neighborhood.
Yeah. And I know you're not going to change the core of West Side Story to make it what you're talking about, but I still think you can criticize some of the decisions there and the story itself, even if it is an older story that's been told many times. But
totally. And the other, this is just you know, a fun little bit of trivia, but the original film, the original Tony was Richard Beymer, who's best known as Richard Horn on Twin Peaks, and then the original riff in the film version was Russ Tamblyn, who played Dr. Jacoby on Twin Peaks.
So just a bunch of people from Twin Peaks.
Well, it also goes to show you that David Lynch is a big kind of musical fantasy guy, because one of his favorite movies in the film that he always references is specifically Wizard of Oz. But I wouldn't be surprised if, like, he's a huge fan of, you know, Singing in the Rain, West Side Story, and musicals like that, because he does bring in a lot of, like,
give me a Lynch full
classic actors. Well, I mean, there's another guy who's kind of had sequences in his films. I mean, Wild at Heart is kind of Wizard of Oz to him.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I really I'm giving it a 4, but my 4 is like it's mostly.
I could go up to a 4. I almost went up to a 4. But
yeah,
I'm.
It's for the wow factor, and I really did feel that this movie benefits watching it on a big screen.
Absolutely agree with that. It's playing a little. If you're in Toronto, Cinesphere is showing it, which is an interesting thing too. And we'll wrap it up. So 4 from Eric, 3.5 from Matt. But I could go up to a 4. I think on a rewatch, I could potentially go up to a 4. And I even started on like the 3. I don't really care about this movie, but it's good. So that's telling you something. And I might go to Cinesphere to go see it, because it's playing Cinesphere for, you know, it seems like Disney is in bed with Cinesphere now, which I think is very intriguing. And because it seems like they want this 2 or 3 week, you know, I mean, Eternals was there for a whole month, so they might get like a new Disney IMAX movie every month at Cinesphere or something that'll play there. Because we had Eternals and now we're getting West Side Story. So that's really, really interesting. And I kind of love that, because I mean, Scotiabank's a great theater for IMAX, but Cinesphere is iconic, the first ever permanent IMAX location. So anyways, long story short, go see it there if you're in Toronto, because I think like that sound and it being that large of a screen, like we saw it in the AVX theater, in the most frigid theater I've ever been in my life. Like Eric and I have told the story of the notorious, infamous Godzilla screening. That was the hottest movie screening I've ever been in my life, where it was unbearable to the point where I did not like that movie because I was so focused on how hot I was. And I think West Side Story, a part of it was so fucking cold in that theater, and I'm a hot boy. Like I'm hot constantly. Like I'm always like I'm sweating in this hoodie and this toque that I committed to. But I'm just constantly like is it warm blooded, and I'm just like hot all the time. I'm just sweaty all the time. That
hot blooded.
But did
check it and
you
see.
notice that too, right? That it was the coldest.
It was freezing. Like I was literally thinking, like, should I be like using my coat as
I almost
a
did that,
blanket?
but I didn't want to like look weird. But then it seemed like I saw someone else get up to go to the bathroom. I think it was Anthony from the movie podcast. And he had his full on winter jacket on as he was going down. And you could also see like Daniel and myself going out to check for Spider-Man tickets, like as the movie was happening too. Cause like every time I had to go to the bathroom, I was like, I'll just check if Spider-Man tickets are on sale yet. And then I walked over and did that. And I also had to warm myself up because it was so cold in the theater.
It was freezing. Like the last time that's kind of happened was at Young and Dundas when they were playing Apollo 11. And
I
like,
wasn't in that screening, I don't think.
They were playing it in their like faux IMAX theater. Mm-hmm. And it was like,
which is also where we saw Godzilla, wasn't it? Or was it the AVX?
I think it was the AVX, but this was in
their
their faux IMAX, and it was literally like the dead of winter in there. It was so
That's
cold.
What this felt like. It was like our first really cold day of the year, and it's like
it was colder in there than it was outside.
It felt like that. It really felt like that. Anyways, we're getting off track, but we're pretty much done the review. You could have clicked out by now if you're still
also
here.
I think an ongoing thing throughout, the next few reviews we should talk about as well is like, a lot of these movies that we're reviewing are over 2 hours long. And so Matt and I have had this ongoing thing. Does he have to go to the bathroom?
Not to overshare. This one, I think I went 3 times? 4?
Yeah.
3 or 4. And I'm horrible, but I'm my own worst enemy because I drink way too many liquids. Like I have a 30-ounce iced coffee throughout the movie, and that's with sometimes I have water on top of that. When we saw Macbeth the other day, because they gave us free drinks and popcorn, and I already had a venti iced coffee, which was my second coffee of the day. So yeah, I'm my own worst enemy when it comes to that. But yeah, if something's over 220, and I mean, weirdly for Don't Look Up, it's under embargo. We won't talk about what we felt.
I think it's
or just broke. Yeah. Anyways, we can talk about that review. You guys can check that out. But I only went once, and that's like 2.5 hours. I should probably just cut this all out. No one wants to hear how many times I have to pee.
I think this is the best stuff.
And then I think sometimes it's like I'm so worried about Spider-Man because it's 2.5 hours, and I'm like that one I'm going to be like sweating just running to the bathroom and coming back because I'm not going to want to miss anything. But
you gotta you just gotta completely dehydrate before that.
It is a night screening, so I won't have to. In the mornings I need a coffee. I need it. I can't. We're seeing a movie tomorrow. Our first movie of, not to date this, but our first movie of 2022. I won't mention what it is, but like it's long, and I'm like, oh man, I gotta have a 30-ounce coffee because I'll probably be up late tonight, like putting this stuff up. But anyways, West Side Story 3.5 for Matt, 4 from Eric. I think it is a solid outing, and to Eric's point, like I like my Spielberg in the more playful adventure, of the 80s and 90s. I think he's such an interesting filmmaker. He is a master and a legend. But he has these phases where I feel like thematically he makes similar styles of movies in each like era of Spielberg, because I think you have, his, late 70s, early 80s stuff into, Temple of Doom, but then you get a couple dramas with Color Purple and Empire of the Sun, but then you get back into adventure movies with like the third Indiana Jones movie, and then Hook, Jurassic Park 2, and then you have the era of Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, AI, Minority Report, Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Munich, and that kind of 2000s, which is I think a different style of drama than what he did in the early 2010s with Warhorse and Lincoln and Bridge of Spies, and the Post. But then you have BFG, Ready Player One, and then I would put West Side Story kind of in that more playful thing. So I think it's interesting. He's obviously one of those guys that I think next year I want to go through and watch all of his stuff in chronological order, because it's been either a long time since I've seen some of his really early stuff, and then some stuff I might have not even seen. I'm going through, I've seen most of it, um, but he is just one of the best ever. So I'll always be excited for a new Spielberg, even if it's something that I'm like, whew. Like I tried to watch Bridge of Spies with my dad, and we both napped.
Right.
But
Well, Bridge of Spies, I actually really like that movie, and I think like even the worst Spielberg movie is worth
yes,
at least kind of talking about. And for me, one of the worst is Always, which is like truly like the worst sort of intentions that Spielberg has that he can bring to a movie, with the kind of like I love that he is very sentimental and wears his heart on his sleeve, but that movie is so sappy and so melodramatic that it just doesn't work. And that was him reteaming with Richard Dreyfuss for a third time. But it's interesting as well. Like you mentioned, sort of like you look at Spielberg in the 70s after, before Jaws, he was doing TV, and then he does Duel, the Dennis Weaver kind of TV movie, which is kind of almost like a prototype for Jaws, and obviously also inspired, movies like Joyride and things like that. And then also Sugarland Express, which is a very different Spielberg. Like that movie could have taken Spielberg in a very different direction in his career. Like that could have been like Robert Altman or Terrence Malick kind of Spielberg, even though it has more of a narrative and it's not maybe, even though Robert Altman, like the way that Spielberg has certain scenes with characters in like even Jurassic Park where they're kind of like talking over each other and in having more than one conversation, like that's very
the
Altman
stuff,
esque. But then after Jaws, he makes movies that are personal but are still kind of in the context of blockbuster movies. Like I think Close Encounters of the Third Kind is his most personal movie. And then like he's making films that will be influential to generations to come, and in the 70s and the 80s into the 90s. And then I think one of the most fascinating moments in Spielberg's career, and one that kind of defined that he could do truly anything, and he already proved that, but making Jurassic Park and then Schindler's List in the same year and releasing both of those movies and then he did it again with War of the Worlds in Munich,
which is nuts.
Astonishing. It truly is like that is just like a guy that is so versatile. But then more recently, I think, and we were talking about this as well when we got out of the movie, and sorry to make this longer, but I think this is worth mentioning.
I'm only missing hockey and dinner, Eric.
Spielberg has gone on to this trend where people were kind of influenced by Spielberg movies. I mean, we've even seen it with, Ghostbusters Afterlife.
Which
I think
is
Jason
a Spielberg
Reitman
movie.
Yeah. But Spielberg now
too
seems to also kind of be trying to ride the trend wave a little bit. I think with West Side Story, I think kind of what kind of set him up to do this, even though he's wanted to make a musical for quite some time, is the success of La La Land. I think La La Land has kind of, you're starting to see, over the last 5 or 6 years, the musical come back. And I think that La La Land's success kind of maybe gave him the confidence to kind of be like, okay, I'm finally going to go and do this. In the same way that Ready Player One is almost like him trying to kind of recreate the magic of what he was doing in the 70s and 80s
and 90s.
And it's almost like the snake eating its own tail, because it's like Ready Player One was inspired by Spielberg movies partly, and so that's fascinating in itself.
I mean, I like Ready Player One, but yes.
But then with The Fabelmans coming up, which is going to be released next year, next Thanksgiving in the US, that movie is going to be a semi-autobiographical coming-of-age film. And he has been on the record saying that he's a huge fan of Lady Bird. And I think that coming-of-age movies in the last 10 years or so, with movies like Boyhood, Lady Bird, Minari, even in Belfast,
so weirdly, other
year,
filmmakers are inspiring him to make his version of that style of movie, right?
Exactly. And I think that that's kind of interesting where he is right now in his career, because you have the statesman Spielberg, who's directed the historical biopics, but now he's kind of also riding this weird trend of like being like, okay, like what are people interested in, or what am I creatively being inspired by other filmmakers? And I feel like The Fabelmans will be really interesting to watch how that kind of unfolds next year, because again, it's like, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a movie that he made because he felt that his dad abandoned him. His mom and dad got divorced, and he always blamed his father for leaving him, and that was kind of him.
And that's what this
going
movie's going to
through
be about, though, right?
And exactly, so it's taking away the sci-fi elements and just doing a straight drama. And I'm wondering if this is going to be Spielberg now looking at it from a point of view, because he always blamed his father. I believe his father's name was Arnold. He always blamed his father because he always thought that his father just left them. But then he found out and he always sided with his mom. But then he said that no, his mother told him that she had an affair, and that's partly why he left. And so now I think with the Fabelmans, I think there's going to be this really interesting sort of gray zone of kind of finding complexity and nuance. I'm not saying Close Encounters is great, like perfect movie, brilliant film. And the more I get older, the more I love that movie. But I think it is very kind of almost like, even though Richard Dreyfuss character isn't a bad guy, it is very much like this guy's leaving his family.
Yeah. Where this might, now he has some perspective on everything. And it's interesting to be directing a, even though it's semi-autobiographical, but like a movie about your own life. I mean, we had that with Kenneth Branagh this year with Belfast, and even with Roma a few years ago as well.
Yeah, Minari,
yeah.
Lady Bird. Like, there's been a lot of Boyhood. There's been a lot of these kind of semi-autobiographical or biographical accounts of even something like The Souvenir, which I really love. The Souvenir Part 1 and 2, Joanna Hogg's movie.
Quoted on the little post on Instagram the other day, bud.
Yeah, so like even those movies like are kind of digging into something that is far more personal, even if they take a more literal or abstract approach to it. It'll be interesting to see that movie. And I just feel like West Side Story almost kind of revitalized Spielberg a little bit in terms of like bringing back the Spielberg that we grew up loving.
I agree with that completely, because as much as I enjoyed Ready Player One, a little bit of a wank off, but like for reasons you just mentioned, but and then BFG, I feel like no one even saw that movie for a family,
not even Mark Rylance,
for a family adventure movie. I'm excited for Fabelmans. I like the casting of Seth Rogen. I mean, Paul Dano's great, and
Michelle Williams
is incredible. So I am very, and he's just, it's Amblin is iconic, and I love that dude. So I think next year, leading into the Fabelmans and it being about his childhood, I think is the perfect time to kind of go back through his filmography. I know it's a lot of movies, but like
it's 34 right now.
I mean, I go through the Marvel movies almost every year, so I feel like, I could probably machete order it and kind of pick and choose what I want to watch, but I want to try to go through and watch everything he's done. And maybe I even started over the holidays this year, but then it'll mess up my letterbox list, and I can't do that. I have to wait till next year for everything to reset. So we'll see. Thank you all for listening. To reiterate, Eric gave it West Side Story a 4. I give it a 3.5. Go check it out at Cinesphere if you're in Toronto. I think that's a great spot to see it. Thank you all for listening. If you, we just did an episode 107 of the Untitled Movie Podcast, which you guys can check out. We had a good debate about what is the last iconic classic Christmas movie. I won't spoil what we determined it was, but
it ends with Henry.
No, it doesn't. I talk about another guy who's trying to be Spielberg with Colin Trevorrow, but
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, JJ as well. I mean,
JJ's the number
obvious
one guy who mimicked his career off of it. But go check out that. A fun conversation. We'll have many more reviews coming out in the next few weeks. We got Don't Look Up, Benedetta, Nightmare Alley, Red Rocket, Being the Ricardos, Licorice Pizza, The Tragedy of Macbeth, Spider-Man No Way Home, The Kingsman, Matrix Resurrections, Cobra Kai 4, hell yeah, and more. So you're in the right spot for all that. But if you want a one-stop shop for everything, just head over to our Letterboxd HQ. It's Untitled_movies. You'll find links to everything over there. As always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at UntitledMoviePodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric March, and you can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
I feel pretty.